The road stretched before Lucas' heart like an endless gray ribbon, scorched by the blazing Montana sun. His old Kenworth, its engine growling like a tired beast, rolled down Highway 2, cutting through endless fields where the wheat swayed like a golden sea and the horizon trembled in the June heat. Lucas sat in the cab, his calloused hands gripping the steering wheel, accustomed to the weight of boxes and the roughness of rope. His dark hair, touched with the first strands of gray, peeked out from under a tattered baseball cap emblazoned with the logo of Hart Trucking, the company he had inherited from his father and kept afloat on his own. At 38, he looked older than he was, his face roughened by the wind and sun, bearing the marks of long hours behind the wheel, but there was still a spark in his gray eyes that the monotony of the journeys could not extinguish. The cabin smelled of coffee from a thermos, engine oil, and something vaguely familiar, the old leather of the seats, maybe, or the dust that settled on everything the road touched. A faded Christmas tree air freshener hung from the rearview mirror, its scent long gone, but Lucas kept it on. It was a talisman, a small thing that connected him to his early days behind the wheel, when he'd been young and hopeful and dreamed of more than hauling combined parts and sacks of feed from Shelby to Great Falls. The radio murmured country music, softly Willie Nelson's voice, husky and warm, singing about the road, about love, about loss. Lucas didn't sing out loud, but the words resonated in him, like an echo of something long forgotten. He loved the simple things, the smell of freshly mown grass, a cold beer after a long day, the sound of gravel under his tires as he pulled into the driveway of their house on the outskirts of Shelby. But lately, those things seemed more and more distant, as if someone were slowly cranking the brightness out of his life. His phone, lying on the worn dashboard, blinked. A message from Aaron. "I'll be late. The presentation is running late." "There's food in the fridge." Lucas glanced at the screen, the corners of his mouth twitching into a small smile, but he didn't respond. Erin, his wife, was always on the go, bright as a campfire, with an energy that could light up Shelby. At 36, she worked in the marketing department of a local ag-tech company, creating glossy brochures and commercials for farmers who could barely afford her ideas. She loved her job, loved the glitz of expensive things bags from a boutique in Billings, the silver earrings Lucas had bought her for their 10th anniversary, spending half his month's take. But her passion for the finer things in life increasingly left Lucas feeling like he was a truck that couldn't keep up with her speed. He wasn't angry. Erin was his anchor, his home, even if it increasingly felt empty when he returned from his trips. They had married young, at 25 and 23, when Lucas still believed he could build something bigger than a family company with 3 trucks and a mountain of debt. Erin had been different then, a girl with pigtails who laughed at his jokes and wasn't afraid to get her jeans dirty helping him unload boxes. Now she wore heels and knew how to pitch an idea so that farmers accustomed to dust and manure would buy her words like a new tractor. Lucas was proud of her, but somewhere deep inside, in a part of himself he rarely looked, he felt like she was slipping away not from him, but from the life they were building together. The road ahead was empty, except for the occasional ghostly car that passed by, leaving a trail of dust in its wake. Lucas adjusted his baseball cap, rubbed the stubble on his chin. He loved these moments when the world narrowed to the cab of the truck, the hum of the engine, and the crunch of the tires. There was no need to pretend, no need to say the right words or explain why he was so tired when all he did was turn the wheel. But the tiredness wasn't in his muscles. It was somewhere deeper, in his bones, in his thoughts that spun in circles like the tires of his Kenworth. Why was he still here, on this road? Why hadn't he sold the company, like Uncle Roy had advised, when his father had died? Why hadn't he followed Erin into her world of ambition and brilliant ideas? The radio crackled, and a voice, rough as gravel under boots, burst into the cabin. "Hey, Lucas, are you there? This is Danny on 4. Lucas reached for the radio, his fingers falling habitually on the microphone. "Here you go, Danny. What's up?" His voice was low, a little hoarse, as if he'd been silent for too long. "Following you, probably about 10 miles. See the cops? Don't want to get into trouble. Just got out of a ticket last month." Lucas chuckled. Danny, an old friend and driver from nearby Great Falls, was always getting into trouble either speeding or forgetting to file paperwork for a load. Clean Dan, just dust and coyotes. Keep your ears open in case. Got it, bro. See you in Shelby for a beer. If Aaron lets go, Lucas joked, but there was a hint of bitterness in his voice. He hung the microphone back up, and silence filled the cabin once more, except for the radio's blare of broken hearts and empty roads. He glanced at his watch. 4:30. Shelby was 2 hours away if traffic cleared in Havre. He would deliver a load of farm machinery parts to the local co-op, then home. Home. The word evoked mixed feelings in him. Their house was small but cozy, 2 stories, with a wooden porch where he and Aaron had once drank coffee in the mornings, watching the sun rise over the fields. Those mornings were rare now. Aaron was up early, heading to the office, and Lucas was either on a trip or sleeping until noon, recovering from the long drive. They still loved each other, he was sure of it, but it had become a quiet love, like an old radio that plays, but you don't listen to it anymore. He remembered Aaron coming home a couple of weeks ago with a new bag, leather and shiny, with a price tag Lucas chose not to mention. It's an investment, she'd said, smiling that smile that always made his heart beat a little faster. But beneath it, he saw a trace of weariness, as if she, too, sensed that something was wrong. They didn't talk about it. Lucas didn't like to talk about feelings. It wasn't in his nature. He preferred to fix things that were broken, whether it was a truck engine or a leaky faucet. But how do you fix something that slips through your fingers like dust? The road began to twist, and Lucas slowed down a bit to avoid going over the edge. A gas station appeared in the distance, one of those isolated ones with a faded sign and a couple of old pickup trucks parked outside. He decided to stop, fill up, and buy a Coke, something cold to shake him out. He parked the truck and hopped down onto the pavement, his legs feeling numb. The air smelled of gasoline and hot earth. It was cool inside the store, the air conditioner humming like an old fan. Behind the counter stood a woman in her 50s, with dyed red hair and tired eyes. She nodded at Lucas like he knew her, even though he had only been there a few times. "Long drive?" she asked, punching his Coke and pack of gum. "As always," he replied, smiling with just the corners of his lips. She chuckled, as if she knew he wouldn't say anything more. Lucas stepped outside, uncorked the bottle, and took a swig. The cold Coke burned his throat, and for a second he felt alive, real. He looked at his truck sitting in the sun, the dust settling on the sides, the heart trucking sign faded but still legible. This was his life, the dusty miles, the heavy boxes, the long hours alone. And somewhere out there, at the end of that road, was Erin, the woman he loved, but who seemed to be retreating further and further into her own world. He got back into the cab, started the engine, and pulled out onto the highway again. The sun was setting, painting the sky red and gold. Lucas turned on the headlights, and their light cut through the twilight like a knife. He thought about what awaited him at home, a cold dinner, an empty living room, maybe a few words with Erin if she wasn't too tired. And yet he drove on, because that was all he knew. The road, the truck, the dusty miles. And somewhere deep inside, the hope that he might yet catch what was slipping away. Mornings in Shelby always began with silence, that special, almost tangible silence where even the wind seemed to stop lest it disturb the sleeping fields. Luca's heart woke at 5, as usual, when the sky was still a cold blue and the first rays of sunlight were just testing their strength on the horizon. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling of their bedroom, where a crack in the plaster reminded him of the Missouri River on a map. Erin was not there. Her side of the bed was neatly made, the pillow unrumpled, a sign that she had either risen early or had not gone to bed at all. Lucas rubbed his face, trying to shake off the weight of sleep, and stood, his joints creaking as if reminding him of every mile he had traveled over the past 18 years. The kitchen smelled of coffee, not the kind he brewed in his thermos, but the expensive, vanilla-flavored kind Erin bought in Billings. The coffee maker hummed softly, but Erin was gone. There was a note on the refrigerator, pinned to it with a tractor-shaped magnet. Early start, campaign deadline. Back late. Kisses Lucas read it without touching it and felt something warm stir in his chest, then fade. She had always been like this, bright and swift, like a river after a spring flood. He had grown accustomed to her late returns, to her energy that filled the house even when she was not there. But lately, these notes had become shorter and her absences longer. He poured coffee into a mug with a faded Montana Grizzlies logo and stepped out onto the porch. The air was crisp, with a taste of dust and grass. A dog barked in the distance, and a mist rose from the fields, thin as a veil. Lucas sat down in the old rocking chair, creaking under his weight, and took a sip. The coffee was bitter, but he drank it not for the taste, but for the ritual. This was his time, those few minutes before a flight when he could just be, not thinking about routes or cargo or bills to pay. But today, the thoughts kept coming. Erin, her late nights, her smile, less frequent but still able to light up his world, and something else he couldn't name but could feel, like a crack in the pavement, small now but growing wider with each passing day. It was a short trip today, an hour's drive to deliver irrigation parts to Chester. Lucas finished his coffee, left his mug in the sink, and walked out to his Kenworth, parked outside his house. The truck looked tired, like him. The paint on the sides was faded, and the Hart trucking lettering was peeling in places. But the engine started on the first try, and as Lucas climbed into the cab, he felt a familiar sense of peace. The road was his sanctuary, a place where everything was simple. A steering wheel, pedals, the horizon. No questions he didn't know the answer to. Highway 2 was almost empty that morning, just a couple of pickup trucks and a tractor crawling slowly toward a field. Lucas turned on the radio, but instead of country, he put on an old Creedence Clearwater revival tape. John Fogerty's voice, husky and honest, sang of the river and home and life rolling on like a wheel. Lucas didn't sing, but his fingers tapped out a rhythm on the steering wheel. He thought about Erin coming home after midnight last night, her eyes tired and the scent of perfume he didn't recognize. She'd said it was a new perfume, a gift from a coworker, and he'd believed it, or wanted to believe it. Chester greeted him with sleepy silence. He unloaded the boxes with the help of a local worker. A guy with freckles and a laugh that was too loud signed the papers and decided to head back. He could be in Shelby by 10 in the morning, which was rare. Maybe he should stop by Erin's office, bring her coffee. She loved little things like that, although she rarely noticed them lately. Lucas turned onto the main street where her company was located, a glass building, too modern for Shelby, with the sign Agritech Solutions glinting in the sun. He could already imagine how he would walk in, how surprised she would be, how she would smile, maybe even hug him right there in her office, where it smelled of paper and her perfume. But her car wasn't in the lot. The white Honda Civic they'd bought 3 years ago was usually parked by the entrance, next to a bed of yellow flowers. Lucas frowned, slowed down, but didn't stop. Maybe she'd parked on the other side. He circled the building, slowly, as if he were afraid to startle something. Empty. He felt something heavy shift in his chest, but he brushed it aside. Deadline, he told himself. She must have gone to a client meeting, or to the coffee shop around the corner. Erin always said the office coffee was terrible. He was about to turn around and head home when he spotted her car. Not at the coffee shop, not at the office. In the parking lot of the Sunset Inn, 2 blocks from downtown. The white Honda was parked at the far end, next to a beat-up pickup and an old Chevy. Lucas slowed his truck until it almost stopped. The clock on his dashboard read 10:03 am. The motel was a run-of-the-mill one-story building with peeling paint, a neon sign that flickered even in the daytime, and a couple of plastic chairs at the entrance. It was a place for truckers, tourists lost on their way to Great Falls, or locals looking for a place to hide. Lucas didn't stop. He drove past, slowly, like a slow-motion scene from an old western where the hero looks at the enemy across a dusty street. He could see her car in the rearview mirror, as real as his own reflection. His heart was beating steadily, but his temples were pulsing, as if someone had turned on a metronome. He didn't turn into the motel. He didn't get out of the truck or knock on any doors or call her. He just kept driving until the motel was out of sight, until the town was behind him, and the highway was his only companion once more. The cabin was silent, the tape had ended, and only the hiss of the speakers broke the silence. Lucas gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He didn't know what to think. Erin in a motel at 10 in the morning? It didn't fit in his head, like a puzzle piece that didn't fit into any of the pictures. Maybe she was visiting a friend, maybe she was meeting with a client, but in a motel, in Shelby, where everyone knew everyone, where rumors traveled faster than dust in a storm. He tried to think of an explanation, but each one seemed as shaky as an old bridge over a river. He remembered how Erin had looked last night, her dark hair pulled back into a messy bun, her smile a little too forced. She had talked about work, about the new ad campaign, about how tired she was. He had listened but not really heard, because his own tiredness was like a buzzing in his ears, constant but familiar. Now he wished he had asked more. Hadn't noticed. Hadn't felt it. The road ahead of him began to blur, and he realized he had been staring at one spot for too long. He blinked, shaking his head like a dog after rain. "Hang in there, Lucas," he said to himself, almost out loud. He turned on the radio, but the music now seemed alien, like a voice from another world. He turned it off and drove in silence, listening only to the hum of the engine and his thoughts circling like crows over a field. By the time he got home, the sun was high, bathing Shelby in golden light. He parked the truck, turned off the engine, and just sat there, looking at their house. The porch, the flower pots Erin watered, even when she was busy, the mailbox with their names scrawled in her neat handwriting. Everything looked normal, but something was different. Not in the house, not in Shelby, in him. He walked inside, threw the keys on the table in the hallway. The kitchen still smelled of her coffee. Lucas opened the refrigerator, took out a bottle of water, but did not drink it. He just stood there, looking at the note on the refrigerator kiss. The word cut like a knife he hadn't expected. He didn't know what to do next, call her, wait for her to come back, or pretend he hadn't seen anything. But he knew one thing. The morning that had started like any other would never be the same again. Something cracked, like ice underfoot, and Lucas felt the ground slipping out from under him, slowly but surely. The sun was setting, and the sky above Shelby was a canvas of crimson and gold, as if someone had spilled paint on a canvas. Lucas' Hart sat on the front porch of his house, in an old rocking chair that creaked under his weight, as if humming an old tune. He held a bottle of beer in his hands, cold, with beads of condensation running down the glass. The air was warm, with the taste of dust and mown grass, and somewhere in the distance a train whistled, its low rumble echoing in his chest like a distant pulse. Lucas looked out onto the street, at the familiar outlines of the neighboring houses, at the lone streetlight that was beginning to flicker, heralding twilight. But his mind was elsewhere. They were carried away back to the past, to where everything was simpler, brighter, where life with Erin was like a song that you wanted to sing over and over again. He closed his eyes, and the memories came flooding back like a river after a rainstorm. He was 25, Erin was 23. They had met at Buck's Bar on the outskirts of Shelby, a place that smelled of spilled beer and French fries, and an old jukebox that played 80s hits. Lucas had just started working for the family company under the wing of his father, whose hands were rough as sandpaper and always smelled of machine oil. Erin was new in town, a Bozeman girl with a marketing degree and dreams of something bigger than little Shelby. She sat at the counter in jeans and a plaid shirt, her pigtails escaping from under her baseball cap, laughing so loudly that Lucas couldn't help but turn around. Her laughter was like cowbells on a windy day, clean, infectious, full of life. He hadn't meant to introduce himself. He just ordered another beer, but the bartender, old Buck, had winked and said, "That girl's going to outlive you, Hart." Lucas had chuckled, but within half an hour they were chatting like old friends. Erin was talking about her childhood in Bozeman, climbing trees and dreaming of being a writer until she realized she was better off selling stories than writing them. Lucas had said little, but he'd listened, transfixed, hanging on her every word, every gesture, the way she'd fiddled with the corner of her napkin, the way her eyes would sparkle when she mentioned her plans. By the end of the night, he knew he was screwed. She was like a sip of cold water after a long flight, the kind that brought you back to life. Their first months together were as easy as a summer breeze. They walked through the fields holding hands, and Erin laughed as Lucas tried to teach her how to drive a truck. She sat in the cab of his old Mac, clutching the steering wheel, screaming with delight as the car jerked into first gear. They kissed under the stars, lying on a blanket in the bed of his truck, and talked about the future, the house they would build, the travels they would take, a life full of laughter and simple joys. Lucas believed then that anything was possible. He was young, full of energy, and Erin was his beacon, his reason to get up in the morning. They were married a year later in a small church on the edge of town. Erin wore a simple white dress she'd bought at a thrift store, but it looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine. Lucas wore the only suit he had, which was a little too small for him, but no one cared. Their friends, truck drivers, farmers, a couple of Erin's friends from Bozeman drank cheap champagne and danced to music playing on an old boombox. Lucas's father, already ill but still going strong, clapped him on the shoulder and said, "Hold on to her, son. People like her are rare." Lucas nodded, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. He knew his father was right. They bought a house, the same one he was sitting in now. It was 2 stories, with peeling paint and a porch they had to fix themselves. Erin drew plans for how they would renovate the kitchen, plant flowers, and put up a swing for future children. Children. The word sounded natural then, like part of their plan. They talked about them, about teaching them to ride a bike, about Erin reading them stories, and Lucas showing them how to fix an engine. But the years passed, and no children came. At first, they didn't pay attention to it. They were young. They had plenty of time. Then the doctors started the tests, the injections. Erin cried at night when she thought Lucas was asleep. He pretended not to hear because he didn't know how to comfort her. The doctors talked about unexplained infertility, about percentages, about options. Erin wanted to try everything from therapy to adoption, but Lucas, whose life had always been about fixing what was broken, couldn't accept that it was out of his control. They stopped talking about children, not because they decided to, but because the words dried up like water in a dry well. The house they were building together became their sanctuary. They painted the walls, picked out curtains, and planted roses by the porch. Erin cooked dinner, and Lucas fixed everything that broke, from the faucet to the old generator. They laughed, they argued, they made up. But somewhere in between, a rift began to grow. Erin got a job at Agritech Solutions, and her world expanded to meetings, presentations, trips to Billings, and even Seattle. Lucas stayed on his road in his cab, with dusty miles that never changed. She became brighter, he became quieter. She bought expensive shoes, and he bought a new tire for his truck. She talked about the future. He talked about how to pay the bills. And yet they loved each other. Or at least Lucas thought so. Now, sitting on the porch, he looked at the roses Erin had planted 10 years ago. They were still blooming, but their petals were paler than before, as if they, too, were tired. He took a sip of beer, but it tasted bland. He couldn't get that morning at the motel out of his head. The white Honda in the parking lot at 10 in the morning when Erin was supposed to be at the office preparing her damn presentation. He didn't want to think about it, but the image kept coming back, like a scene from a movie he couldn't turn off. He tried to rationalize, was she dating a friend? Was a client from out of town staying at the motel and they were discussing a contract? But in Shelby? In a motel where the sheets smelled like cheap laundry detergent and the walls held secrets? Lucas felt something inside him tighten, like a spring about to snap. He remembered a time, about 5 years ago, when he and Erin had driven to Lake Francis. It was a rare day off when neither of them had anything to do. They had taken a pickup truck, an old blanket, and a basket of sandwiches. Erin had put on a dress, a light blue one with little flowers on it, and her hair had flown in the wind as they drove with the windows down. They lay on the shore, looking up at the clouds, and Erin had said, "You know, Lucas, I wish we could always be like this, free, happy." He had put his arms around her, feeling the warmth of her skin, and promised that he would. But promises, like roses, faded with time. Now he could see how they had grown apart. Not suddenly, not in one moment, but slowly, like a river changing course year after year. Erin was working late more and more often, her phone flashing with messages that she swiped away before showing him. She stopped asking about his flights, about his day, and he stopped telling her. He didn't know when it had started, maybe when they stopped talking about kids, maybe when she got a promotion and he was still the same Lucas who hauled parts and fixed trucks. But he could feel it now. They were in the same house, but in different worlds. Lucas finished his beer and set the bottle on the porch railing. He thought about calling her, asking where she had been this morning. But what would he say? I saw your car at the motel. It sounded like an accusation, and he didn't want to accuse. Not now. Not until he figured out what was going on. He stood up, feeling the chair creak one last time, and walked into the house. It was quiet inside, except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. He walked into the living room, where their wedding photo sat on a shelf, Erin smiling, her eyes shining, him looking at it like it was a miracle. He touched the frame but didn't pick it up. Instead, he went into the kitchen, got another beer, and walked back out onto the porch. Night was falling on Shelby, and the stars were starting to show through the sky like sparks on dark fabric. Lucas stared at them, trying to remember the last time he and Erin had laid on a blanket, looking at the stars. He couldn't, and that scared him more than the car outside the motel, because it meant that the crack he felt wasn't just in him, it was in them. In their love, in their life, in what they had built together, and he didn't know how to fix it. The twilight in Shelby was soft, like an old blanket, draping the town in silence and shadow. Lucas' heart sat behind the wheel of his Kenworth, parked outside his house, watching the light in their kitchen windows flicker as if trying to say something. He'd just come from a short run to Havre, delivering tractor parts, and he could still feel the dust on his skin, the smell of gasoline in his hair. But there was something else today, a heaviness that had settled in his chest since that morning at the motel, when he'd seen Erin's car where it shouldn't have been. He hadn't talked to her about it. He couldn't. The words were stuck like nails in old wood, and he was afraid that if he tried to pull them out, everything would fall apart. The front door opened and Erin stepped out onto the porch, her silhouette illuminated by the warm light from within. She was wearing a flowing dress, the navy blue one with thin straps that he loved because it made her look like the girl who had laughed at Bucks 15 years ago. She waved at him, smiling, and Lucas felt his heart tighten. He turned off the engine, climbed out of the cab, and walked toward her, trying not to look into her eyes for too long. There was something there he didn't want to see, not a lie, not the truth, but something in between, like smoke you couldn't catch. You're late, she said, hugging him. Her hair smelled like lavender, and he pressed his face against it for a second, inhaling, as if the scent could bring everything back. Got stuck in Havre. Traffic jam on the way out, he lied, not looking at her. He didn't want to lie, but the truth was too heavy to hold in his hands. Inside, the house was cozy, like a postcard from the past. Candles burned on the table, their flames reflected in glasses of red wine. The air smelled of roasted meat, and Rosemary Erin had cooked steak, his favorite, with mashed potatoes and green beans. She smiled as she poured the wine and talked about light things, a new advertising campaign, a funny client who had ordered brochures with a typo. Lucas nodded and ate, but the taste of the food was distant, like a memory. He looked at her slender fingers clutching the stem of her glass, at the dimple in her cheek that appeared when she laughed, and tried to figure out who this woman was. His Erin or someone else who had taken her place. After dinner, she reached for him, her hand sliding over his shoulder, her lips finding his neck. Let's go upstairs, she whispered, and her voice was soft as velvet, but there was something urgent, almost desperate, about it. Lucas felt his body respond, the habit, the desire, the love that still lived inside him. But something stopped him. Not the image of the car outside the motel, not the questions he hadn't asked. Something deeper, like an instinct that whispered, not now, not like this. He pulled away gently, taking her hand and kissing her knuckles. I'm tired, Erin. It's been a long day, he said, and his voice sounded alien, as if someone else was speaking for him. She froze, her smile faltering, but she quickly hid it behind a small laugh. Okay, man, Rest. I'll clean up here. She turned to the table, collecting the plates, and Lucas watched her back, feeling an invisible wall growing between them. He wanted to say something, to hug her, to bring back that evening when they could just be together, but instead he stood up and went to the bedroom. The night was restless. Lucas lay staring at the ceiling, where the crack still resembled a river. Erin slept beside him, her breathing even, but he knew she wasn't truly asleep. He could feel her tension, like the electric current in the air before a thunderstorm. He wanted to touch her, but he couldn't. Not tonight. Not after what he'd seen. The next morning was gray, with low clouds that hung over Shelby like wet laundry. Erin left early, kissing him on the cheek and saying, "I'm staying over at Liz's tonight. Girls' night. Don't wait for me." Lucas nodded, but her words settled on him like dust on old furniture. Liz had been her friend since Bozeman, but they hadn't seen each other much lately. Something about Erin's tone, her urgency, made him wary. He spent the day in the garage, fixing one of the trucks, an old freightliner that coughed like an old sick man. The work was a distraction, but thoughts of the motel kept returning like flies to an open jar. By evening, he couldn't take it anymore. He picked up the phone and dialed Liz. She answered on the third ring, her voice cheerful but surprised. "Lucas, I haven't heard from you in a while. How are you?" "It's okay, Liz. Listen, is Erin with you today?" He tried to sound casual, but his throat tightened. The pause on the other end was too long. "Erin? No, she's not at my place. We haven't seen each other in a couple of months. Is something up?" Lucas felt the floor shift beneath his feet. He mumbled something about confusion and hung up without listening to her questions. His hand shook as he set the phone down on the workbench. Erin's lie was like a punch to the solar plexus, sharp, unexpected. He didn't want to believe it, but the truth was staring him in the eye like a beast in the dark. He didn't think about what he was doing. He took the keys to his truck, an old Ford with a worn seat, and drove off. The Sunset Inn was there, as always, its neon sign blinking in the evening light. Erin's car was there too, at the far end of the lot, next to a black Dodge. Lucas parked across the street, in the shade of an old oak tree, and turned off the engine. His heart was pounding so loudly, he was sure he could hear it even in the motel. He waited. He didn't know what to do, but he waited. The minutes dragged on like hours, and he'd almost convinced himself to leave when a door opened. Erin stepped out first, her hair down and her dress, that blue one, slightly wrinkled. Behind her was a man. Lucas recognized him immediately. Jay Harper, the local realtor with the smooth smile and expensive cologne who always showed up at town events with a glass of whiskey in his hand. He was older than Lucas, maybe 45, with a touch of gray hair and the confident gait of a man who knew the world was his. They walked hand in hand, like lovers unafraid of prying eyes. Jay wrapped his arms around Erin's waist, his hands sliding lower, squeezing her buttocks, and she laughed, throwing her head back. Lucas watched as Jay pulled her close, kissing her neck, his fingers lifting the hem of her dress, brushing her breasts. They didn't see him. They didn't see anything but each other. Lucas felt the air in the truck become thick as tar. He couldn't breathe. He didn't get out. He didn't scream. He didn't slam his fist on the steering wheel. He just watched them walk to Jay's car, Erin climbing into the passenger seat and Jay slapping her knee before closing the door. Lucas saw it all, every detail seared into his memory like a knife into wood. When the Dodge pulled away, he started the engine and drove the other way, aimless, without a plan. The road was dark, just the headlights picking out bits of asphalt like scraps of his life. As he drove, his thoughts swirled like crows over a field. Erin, Jay, the motel, their laughter, her dress crumpled by someone else's hands. He remembered the way she had looked at him yesterday, the way her fingers had touched his shoulder, how she had wanted to be with him. Was that a lie? Or did she love them both? Lucas didn't know. All he knew was that the world he had built with her had crumbled like an old barn in the wind. He stopped at a river a few miles outside of town. He stepped out of the truck, feeling the gravel crunch under his boots. The river flowed slowly, its surface reflecting the stars like a broken mirror. Lucas sat down on the bank, picked up a rock, and tossed it into the water. The ripples spread, but the water was smooth again, as if nothing had happened. He wanted to scream, but instead he just sat there, staring into the darkness. The decision didn't come right away. It grew inside him, like a seed pushing through the earth. He wouldn't make a scene. He wouldn't hit Jay or demand an explanation from Aaron. He wouldn't be the one clinging to the broken pieces. Lucas Hart was a man who fixed what was broken, but it was broken too badly. He decided he was going to leave. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. He would sell the company, or leave it to Danny, or just leave it. He would leave Shelby, this dust, these memories. He would start over, somewhere where the sun was familiar. He got back into the truck, feeling the decision settle in him like a stone at the bottom of a river. The drive home was long, but he drove without looking back. Something was ending, and something was beginning. And Lucas knew that whatever the new road was, he would travel it alone. The silence in the Hart house had grown so thick it could be cut like cold butter. Lucas sat at the kitchen table, staring at the mug of cold coffee he held in his hands like an anchor, keeping him from falling over the edge. Erin was somewhere in the house. He could hear her moving around upstairs, her steps light but staccato, as if she, too, were afraid to upset the delicate balance. They hadn't spoken since the night she'd returned from her girls' night, which had turned out to be a lie. Lucas hadn't asked where she'd been, and she hadn't explained. Their words, which had once flowed easily like a river, now stuck like stones in his throat. He'd watched her as she came down the stairs in her formal work suit, her dark hair pulled back into a neat bun, and thought, "Who are you now?" But he'd said nothing. Erin paused in the kitchen doorway, holding her purse, the leather one he hadn't wanted to ask the price for. "I'm going to the office. Presentation today. Be back late," she said, her voice even but cracked, like parched earth. Lucas nodded, not looking up. He waited for her to say something else, maybe ask why he was silent, or just touch his shoulder like she had before. But she only lingered for a second, as if she wanted to add something, and then she was gone. The door slammed, and the sound of her footsteps faded into the morning silence of Shelby. Lucas was alone. The house he and Aaron had built with such love, with the worn hardwood floors he'd sanded with his own hands, the curtains she'd picked out in Billings, the pictures on the mantel of them, laughing under the stars, now seemed as empty as a burnt-out barn. He stood, dropped his mug in the sink, and walked to his truck. He needed a ride. A long one. A long one. One that would drown out the thoughts that spun around in his head like an old vinyl record with a stuck needle. He called Danny, an old buddy who drove the second truck for Hart Trucking. "Take local orders for a couple weeks. I'm heading to Idaho. Delivery to boys, then maybe Spokane," Lucas said without elaborating. Danny, accustomed to his terseness, just chuckled. "Everything okay, Lucas? You sound like you swallowed a nail." Lucas lied that everything was fine and hung up. He loaded the Kenworth with boxes of farm equipment, checked the tire pressure, filled the tank to capacity, and drove out of Shelby without looking back. The road was his sanctuary, the only place he felt like himself, not a husband, not a business owner, not a man whose life was crumbling like an old bridge under the weight of his cargo. Highway 2 wound west through the vast Montana fields, where the wheat swayed in the wind and the sky was so big it felt like it could swallow you whole. Lucas turned on the radio, but instead of music, he chose silence, just the hum of the engine and the squeal of the tires on the asphalt. He loved that sound. It was honest, real, demanding nothing more than his attention to the road. His hands, calloused and strong, were on the wheel, and he could feel the truck responding to his every move, like an old friend who would never betray him. As the miles passed, Lucas's thoughts wound like a road, back to Erin, to the motel, to what he'd seen. Jay Harper, his hand on her waist, her laugh, so familiar and yet so foreign. He tried to figure out when it had all started. A month ago? A year? Or had it always been there, hidden behind her smiles, her late nights, her new perfume that didn't smell like her? He thought back to their early years lying on a blanket by Lake Francis, her drawing plans for their house, dreaming of children that never came. Was this the crack that had started it all? The infertility they'd been unable to overcome, the one that had robbed them not just of their futures, but of a part of themselves. He stopped at a gas station near the Idaho border, where the air was cooler and the mountains on the horizon rose like silent sentinels. He got a Coke from the machine and sat on the hood of the truck, watching the sun set. The sky was burning orange, as if someone had set the horizon on fire. Lucas sipped the Coke, feeling the cold fizzy stuff burn his throat, and thought about what he'd lost. Not just Erin, though losing her was like a knife he could still feel in his chest. He'd lost himself. The Lucas who'd believed in the future, who'd laughed with her at the bar, who'd promised her the stars. Now he was a man who hauled freight and fixed trucks and didn't speak when he should have. The drive to Boise was long, and Lucas drove slowly, letting the miles drag on. He remembered a time, about 10 years ago, when he and Erin had gone to Idaho for the weekend. Just like that, without a plan. They had stayed at a motel, not a Sunset Inn, but a small, cozy one overlooking the river. They had drunk cheap wine from plastic cups and danced to the radio in their room, laughing when she stepped on his toes. He had thought it would always be like this, the two of them against the world. Now he was driving down the same road, but alone, and the motel he passed seemed a mockery of that memory. In Boise, he unloaded the boxes, signed the papers, and decided not to go back right away. He took another assignment to Spokane, Washington. That meant a couple more days on the road, a couple more days of silence, a couple more days to figure out what to do next. He didn't know if he wanted to go back to Shelby. The house that had been his anchor now felt like an empty shell. Erin was there, but her presence only made the emptiness worse. He couldn't look at her without seeing Jay Harper, his hands, her laughter. And yet he loved her. Or the Erin he remembered. He didn't know if she was still there, somewhere beneath the lies and the new perfume. That night, he pulled into a truck stop where a neon sign for a cafe flashed the promise of the best pie in Idaho. He went inside and ordered a slice of apple pie and coffee that was better than he expected. Behind the counter sat a woman in her 50s, with tired eyes and a kind smile. She was chatting with another driver, but Lucas wasn't listening. He ate the pie, tasting the sweetness of the dough mingling with the bitterness of the coffee, and thought about his decision. To leave, to start over. But where? Shelby was all he knew. His company, his truck, his road. He was not a man to move easily, but to stay meant drowning in this pain, this silence, this empty house. He remembered his father once telling him, "The road always tells the truth, son. If you don't know what to do, drive until you figure it out." Lucas hadn't understood what he meant then. Now he did. The road was his mirror, his confessional. He couldn't lie to himself here. He knew he couldn't go back to Erin like nothing had happened. But he didn't know if he had the strength to leave completely. He thought about her, her smile, her pigtails at the bar, her hand in his. And the way she'd laughed with another man, the way her dress had wrinkled under his fingers. Love and pain mixed inside him like oil and water, and he didn't know how to separate them. At dawn, he was back on the road. The mountains of Idaho gave way to the forests of Washington, and Lucas drove, feeling the truck become an extension of himself. He didn't turn on the radio. He didn't want to. The silence was more honest. He thought about what would happen when he returned. If he returned, he could sell the company Danny had long hinted that he was ready to take on more. He could move to Oregon or further afield to California, where no one knew his name. He could be someone else, not Lucas Hart, fixing trucks and loving a woman who might not be his anymore. But as he drove, the miles flowed beneath his wheels like a river, and Lucas felt himself again in the movement, in the rhythm of the road. Not the husband, not the owner, but simply Lucas, the man who knew how to hold the wheel, how to listen to the engine, how to find his way in the dark. And somewhere out there, at the end of this road, he hoped to find an answer. Not to the question of why Erin had done what she had done, but to the question of who he would be without her. The drive back to Shelby was long, not so much in miles as in thoughts, which Lucas' heart sifted through like old photographs, faded but still sharp as a knife. His Kenworth rolled down Highway 2, cutting through the twilight, the headlights picking up bits of asphalt like pieces of his own life. worn but still leading somewhere. He'd spent nearly 2 weeks driving, from Boise to Spokane and then on to Seattle, the rain pounding the cab as if it wanted to wash away everything he'd left behind. But it hadn't. Erin was with him, not in the cab, not in reality, but in his head, in her laugh he'd heard in the motel, in her dress crumpled by someone else's hands. As Lucas drove, the road was honest, as it always was. It didn't lie, it didn't pretend, but it didn't give answers either. Only time. Time to think, time to decide, time to feel like yourself again. He pulled into Shelby at sunset, the sky ablaze with red warning. The town was the same as ever. Sleepy streets, a couple of pickups parked at a gas station, the neon sign for Bucks blinking like an old friend who never changed. But the house he pulled up to wasn't home anymore. It was a shell, empty as a nest from which the birds had flown. Lucas turned off the engine but didn't get out right away. He sat looking out at the porch, at the roses Erin had planted, at the rocking chair where he'd once drank beer and listened to her laugh. It all seemed foreign now, like the set of a movie he was no longer in. Erin was home. Her white Honda sat in the driveway, shiny as if it had just come out of the car wash. Lucas felt something heavy in his chest, but he didn't let it come out. He was calm, not cold, not angry, just calm as a lake on a windless day. The decision he'd made on the road had hardened, becoming a part of him, like the calluses on his palms. He wouldn't yell. He wouldn't slam his fist on the table. He'd just do what he had to do. He walked into the house, and the scent of her perfumed lavender with something new, unfamiliar, hit him like a reminder. Erin was standing at the stove, stirring something in a pot. She turned, her face lit up with a smile, the same one that had once made his heart beat faster. Now it only tightens. "Lucas, you're back. I didn't know when you'd be home, but I made your favorite chili. Come sit down, it'll be ready in a minute." Her voice was light, almost playful, as if nothing had changed, as if she wasn't in a motel with Jay Harper, as if their lives hadn't cracked like old asphalt in the sun. Lucas looked at her dark hair pulled back into a loose ponytail, at her t-shirt, slightly wrinkled but still fitted as if it knew how to catch his eye. He nodded, but didn't sit. Instead, he walked past her, into the bedroom, without saying a word. Erin froze, her spoon resting in the pot. "Lucas, is something wrong?" Her voice shook like a string pulled too tight. He didn't answer. He walked up the stairs, feeling each step creak under his boots, as if the house, too, was tired of being silent. In the bedroom, he pulled out her suitcase, the one they'd bought for their first trip to Idaho, with a frayed handle and broken wheel. He opened the closet and began taking her things off the hangers: dresses, blouses, the blue sundress she'd worn at Lake Francis. Each movement was measured, almost ritualistic. He didn't throw things, didn't rip them. He folded them carefully, as if that might soften what he was about to do. Erin entered the bedroom a few minutes later, her steps quick, almost panicked. "Lucas, what are you doing?" Her voice was higher than usual, with a hint of fear that she was trying to hide. He didn't turn around, continuing to pack her sweaters into the suitcase. "I'm packing your things," he said quietly but firmly, like a man who had already made up his mind. "What? Why?" "Lucas, stop, let's talk." She stepped towards him, her hand touching his shoulder, but he gently pulled away, not looking at her. "We have nothing to talk about, Erin." His voice was even, but there was power in it, like an engine running at low revs, but ready to explode at any moment. She froze, her breathing becoming ragged. "Lucas, please tell me what happened. You just left, didn't say a word, and now. What did I do?" He stopped, holding her silk scarf, the one she had worn on their 10th anniversary. He looked at her for the first time that evening, and her eyes, the ones he loved, were full of tears. But he saw more than tears. He saw the motel, Jay Harper, her laughter, her dress crumpled by someone else's hands. "I saw you, Erin," he said, his voice like gravel under wheels. "At the motel, with him." Her face went pale, as if someone had turned off a light inside her. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. She took a step back, leaning against the wall, her hands shaking. Lucas, it's not what you think. He shook his head, turning back to the suitcase. Don't, Aaron, don't lie. I saw it with my own eyes. You were with Jay Harper. You laughed. He touched you. I'm not blind. Lucas, please, let me explain. Her voice broke, and she took a step towards him, trying to catch his eye. It was a mistake. I didn't mean to. It's just, I'm confused, Lucas. You're always on flights. You're never here. I felt alone, and lonely? He finally turned to face her, his gray eyes cold but not unkind. I was here, Aaron. Every time I came back. I built this house with you. I loved you, and you chose it, in a motel, at 10 in the morning. She covered her mouth with her hand, tears streaming down her cheeks, but Lucas felt no pity. Nothing but a strange lightness, as if a heavy burden he had carried for years had finally been lifted. He wasn't angry. He was free. It was a new feeling, and it scared him, but it was real. Lucas, I didn't mean to hurt you. I love you, I swear. It was stupid. I don't know how it happened. Please, let's talk. We can fix this. Her voice trembled. She reached out her hand, but he pulled back as if her touch could burn. Fix it. He almost smiled, but it was a bitter, empty smile. Some things can't be fixed, Aaron. You know that. I know that. He closed the suitcase, zipped it up. She looked at him, her face a mixture of fear, guilt, and something else, confusion. She was used to Lucas always being there, always coming back, always forgiving her little weaknesses. But this Lucas was different. He didn't yell, didn't blame, didn't beg. He was calm, and that scared her more than any scandal. Lucas, you can't just leave. This is our home, our life. We've been through so much together. She was almost screaming now, her voice shaking like a leaf in the wind. He turned to her, his gaze so hard that she fell silent. A divorce, Aaron. I want a divorce. And I don't want a woman of easy virtue in my house. The word came out like a bullet, and he was surprised at how sharp it sounded. He hadn't meant to say it, but it came out as if it had been waiting for its moment. Erin flinched as if struck, her eyes widening, the tears stopping as if frozen. She looked at him as if he were a stranger, and maybe he was. Lucas. Her voice was barely audible, like the whisper of the wind in a field. You can't say that. You can't. I can, he said, his voice hard as steel. I saw what you did. I saw who you are now, and I don't want to be a part of it. He picked up the suitcase and carried it downstairs, setting it by the front door. Erin followed him, her steps unsteady, like someone walking on thin ice. Where should I go? Lucas, please don't do this. We can start over. I swear I'll change. He stopped at the door, turned to face her. You've changed already, Erin, and so have I. This is the end. She grabbed his hand, her fingers digging into his wrist, but he pulled away gently but firmly. Go away, Erin. To Liz. To him. Anywhere, but not here. She stood there, looking at him, her face wet with tears, but there was something new in her eyes, not just pain, but the knowledge that she had lost him. Not in that moment, but somewhere before, in the motel, in her lies, in their silence. She opened her mouth to say something else, but Lucas shook his head. That's enough, he said quietly. Just go away. Erin picked up her suitcase, her movements mechanical, like someone on autopilot. She walked out onto the porch, standing there, looking at the roses she'd planted, the porch where they'd had coffee in the morning. Then she turned to him, her lips trembling. I loved you, Lucas. I really did. He didn't answer. He watched her get into her Honda, watched the headlights come on, watched the car disappear into the darkness. The house was quieter, the walls were silent, but their silence was louder than any scream. Lucas closed the door, walked into the living room, and sat down on the couch. He didn't turn on the lights. He just sat there, feeling the emptiness fill the space where their life used to be. He didn't cry. He didn't get angry. He was free, and that was worse than any pain. Because freedom meant he was alone now. Alone with the road, with the truck, with the miles that lay ahead. And he knew that tomorrow he would drive again, because that was all he knew how to do. But this time it would be a different road. Not the one that led home, but the one that led forward. Shelby slept under the blanket of late summer, the air thick with the smell of ripe wheat and the distant hum of trains crossing the Montana plains. Lucas Hart sat on the porch of his house, half his size now, looking up at the stars, which seemed brighter tonight, as if they knew he needed their light. The rocking chair creaked under his weight, old but true, like his truck parked at the curb. The house was quiet, too quiet, since Erin had left with her suitcase, leaving behind the echo of her last, "I loved you." Lucas didn't feel angry. He didn't feel empty, as he'd expected. He felt a strange clarity, as if the road he'd been traveling his whole life had finally shown him a turn he'd never noticed before. It had been a month since the night he'd packed up her things. A month of living in that house alone, sleeping on the living room couch because the bed in the bedroom still smelled of her perfume, taking short flights to escape the confines of Shelby, where every corner was a reminder of the past. But Erin hadn't disappeared. She'd called, she'd texted, she'd shown up outside the house like a ghost he couldn't exorcise. And every time he saw her name on his phone or heard a knock on the door, his heart would clench, not from pain, but from weariness. He was ready to move on, but she didn't seem to have let go yet. The first call came 3 days after she left. Lucas was in the garage, under the old Freightliner, when the phone vibrated in his pocket. He wiped his hands on an oil-smelling rag and looked at the screen. "Erin." He didn't answer. A minute later, a text came, "Lucas, please talk to me. I know I made mistakes, but we need to talk about this." He read it but did not answer. The words seemed empty to him, like the wind blowing dust across an empty field. He returned to the truck, tightened the bolt, and tried to forget. But she didn't give up. She called again, the next day, then the day after that. The messages came one after another. "I didn't want it to turn out this way. I need you. Let's just meet and talk." Lucas read them, but each time he put his phone down, as if it might burn him. He didn't want her words. He didn't want her excuses. He'd seen her with Jay Harper, seen her laugh, her dress bunching under his hands. It wasn't just cheating, it was a crack that showed how far they'd come from who they were. A week later, she showed up at the house. Lucas was in the kitchen, drinking coffee, when he heard a knock on the door. He knew it was her before he opened it. Erin was standing on the porch, wearing jeans and a white blouse, her hair down and her eyes red as if she'd been crying. She didn't look like the Erin who worked in the office, with her glossy brochures and expensive bags, but like the Erin he'd met at Buck's bar, vulnerable, real. "Lucas, can I come in?" Her voice was quiet, almost pleading. He stepped aside to let her pass, but said nothing. She walked into the living room, stopping at the mantelpiece where their wedding photograph stood. Her fingers touched the frame, but she did not take it. "I know what you saw, and I know how you feel. But Lucas, it was a mistake. I was confused. I didn't want to lose you." She turned to him, her eyes searching for him, but he was looking at the floor, at the worn wood he'd laid himself 15 years ago. "Erin, I don't want to discuss this," he said, his voice as smooth as the asphalt of a highway. "You made a choice. I made mine, too." "A choice? What choice, Lucas? Kick me out? Ruin everything we had?" Her voice broke, and she took a step toward him, but stopped when she saw him tense up. "It wasn't me who ruined it, Erin. You know that." He looked at her, and there was no anger in his gray eyes, only weariness and something else, a determination she didn't recognize. "I saw you with him. I can't forget it. I don't want to." She covered her mouth with her hand as if to hold back the tears, but they kept coming. "Lucas, I love you. I've always loved you. Jay, it was stupid. It didn't mean anything. I felt alone. You were always traveling. You never told me what was going on with you. I didn't know how to get through to you." He shook his head, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Don't, Erin. Don't blame me for what you did. I was here. I came back every time. I built this house for us, and you chose a motel, and him." She flinched as if struck, but she didn't back down. Lucas, please. Let's try again. We can go to a psychologist, we can. No, he interrupted, his voice hard as stone. I don't want to try. I want a divorce. The word hung in the air, heavy as a hammer. Erin looked at it, her face a mixture of shock and pain. She was used to Lucas fixing everything trucks, cranes, their lives. But this Lucas was different. He didn't yell, didn't blame, didn't beg. He was calm, and that scared her more than any anger. She saw him in a new way, not as a husband who always came back, but as a man who had decided to leave. And she knew, too late, that she had lost him. You can't just leave, Lucas. This is our home, our life. Her voice was shaking, but there was anger in it, as if she was trying to cling to something that was already slipping away. I'm not leaving until we get this house sorted out, he said, crossing his arms. We'll split it down the middle, or you can keep it, but then pay me my share. She froze, her eyes widening. Are you serious? You want money for our house? This isn't about money, Erin. This is about ending things honestly. I don't want to live in this house. It's yours if you want it, but I won't hold it like a chain. She looked at him, her lips trembling, but she was not crying. Not now. She saw that he was not joking, that this was not a flash of anger, but a decision he had made somewhere on the road, alone, under the stars. And it was worse than screaming. It was finality. Erin left that night without another word, but the calls and texts continued. She wrote long letters, full of apologies, memories, and promises. She came again, stood on the porch, begging him to listen. Lucas opened the door, looked at her, but his heart was somewhere far away, on the road where he could breathe. He listened to her, but did not answer. Not because he wanted to punish her, but because he saw no point. Words could not bring back what was lost. They could not erase the image of Jay Harper, his hands, her laughter. The divorce process began slowly, like a truck pulling away with a heavy load. Lucas hired a lawyer, an old friend of his father's, who said little but was thorough. Erin hired her own, a woman from Billings with sharp eyes and an expensive watch. They met in the lawyer's office, across the table from each other, and Lucas watched her sign the papers, her hand shaking but trying to keep her composure. They divided everything, the bank accounts, the car, the house. Lucas insisted that Erin keep the house. He didn't want it, didn't want to return to those walls where their old laughter and arguments still echoed. But he asked for his share, not out of greed, but out of necessity. He needed the money to start over, somewhere beyond Shelby, beyond the motel, beyond the past. Erin agreed. She sold the stock she'd earned from her company and paid him half the value of the house. The money arrived in his account a month later, and Lucas stared at the numbers on his phone, feeling a strange sense of relief. This was the end. Not the one he dreamed of when they danced to the radio in an Idaho motel, but an ending that was honest. Erin came over one last time to pick up the last of her things. She stood in the living room, holding a box of books and old photographs. Lucas looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something like pity. She looked lost, like someone lost in a field and not knowing where the exit was. Her eyes, once bright as stars, were now dull, and he knew she was seeing him in a new way. It was too late. "Lucas, are you sure?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. "We could." "No, Erin," he interrupted, gently but firmly. "We couldn't. Not now." She nodded, her lips pressed together, and she walked out without looking back. Lucas stood at the window, watching her car disappear into the darkness, and felt the house grow even quieter. The walls were silent, but their silence was light, as if they, too, had let go. He was free. Not angry, not broken, but free. And this freedom was his new path, one he didn't yet know, but was ready to take. Dust rose from the tires of the old Ford as Lucas Hart turned off the highway onto a narrow dirt road that led to the plot of land he now called his own. The Montana autumn sun hung low, painting the sky shades of rust and gold, and the air was cool, with the taste of dry grass and the distant smoke of neighbors' campfires. The plot of land was 10 miles from Shelby, beyond the hills, where the plains stretched out like an endless canvas, broken only by the occasional pine tree and an old barbed wire fence. Lucas had chosen the place for a reason. It was far enough away that he could forget about the city, but close enough that he wouldn't feel cut off from the world. There was no noise from Shelby, no neon signs, no memories of the home he had left for Aaron. Only a silence so deep it seemed alive, like breathing. Lucas had bought the land a month after the money for the house had hit his account. It had been an impulse buy, but not a thoughtless one. He was tired of the commute, the cab of a truck, the dusty miles that led nowhere. He had turned heart trucking over to Danny, keeping only the old Kenworth in case the road called again. But now he wanted something different, not escape, but roots. Not a house that smelled like her perfume, but a place that would be his. The lot was small 5 acres, with a rickety barn and an old well that the realtor said was still producing. Lucas didn't haggle. He signed the papers, shook the agent's hand, and felt something stir inside him, not relief, not joy, but something like hope. He parked the truck next to the barn, stepped out, and breathed in the air that smelled of earth and freedom. The wind tugged at his baseball cap, and he adjusted it, pulling the brim down over his eyes in a practiced motion. The land was bare, covered in coarse grass and rocks, but Lucas saw more in it than just a vacant lot. He saw a workshop, not just a garage for trucks, but a place where he could fix anything that was broken, from engines to old motorcycles, from tractors to someone else's hopes. He didn't know where to start, but he knew this would be his job, his life. The first thing he did was work on the barn. The walls were solid, if darkened by age, and the roof leaked in only one corner. Lucas spent the first few days sorting through the junk, rusty tools, old tires, cans of paint that had long since dried. He worked alone, listening to an old radio that picked up only one station, country music. Johnny Cash's voice, husky and honest, accompanied him as he hauled boards, cleaned the floor, and shored up the beams. He took his time. For the first time in years, he had time not for trips, not for bills, but for himself. The shop began to take shape. Lucas bought a workbench, old but sturdy, from a farmer in Havre who was selling off his belongings before moving. He brought in shelving, tools, an old welder he found at a crossroads for half price. Every morning he rose at dawn, drank coffee from a thermos, sat on the hood of his truck, and looked out over the site, imagining what it would look like in a year, in 5. He had no grand plans, no dreams of riches or fame. He just wanted a place where he could be himself, where his hands, accustomed to a wheel and a drawer, could create something new. But the emptiness around him was as liberating as it was terrifying. At night, when he stayed in the barn, unfolding his sleeping bag on the old mattress, the silence grew louder. It wasn't like the silence in the truck, where the hum of the engine drowned out his thoughts. Here in the darkness, surrounded only by the creaking of the walls and the distant howls of coyotes, Lucas heard his memories. Erin, her laughter at Buck's, her tears when he said divorce, her car driving away into the night. He didn't miss her, or at least he told himself he didn't. But her absence was like a shadow that followed him even under this new sun. Erin kept calling. Sometimes he answered, but the conversations were short, like gunshots. "Lucas, how are you?" she'd ask, her voice soft but wary, as if she were afraid to scare him away. "I'm fine," he'd say, and that was it. She'd write long messages, full of apologies, memories, questions. "I saw your truck at the gas station. Did you move? I miss our home. Maybe we can meet and just talk?" Lucas read, but rarely responded. Not out of malice, but because he saw no point. She was part of his past, and he was building a new one, slowly, brick by brick, plank by plank. One day she arrived. Lucas was in the barn, sanding down an old metal frame he planned to use for a lift, when he heard gravel crunching under his tires. He came out, wiping his hands on a rag, and saw her Honda parked at the edge of the lot. Erin was standing there, wearing jeans and a light jacket, her hair down and her face tired, like she hadn't slept. She looked at the barn, at the pile of lumber, at the truck, and there was something in her eyes Lucas couldn't quite place, a mixture of surprise and pain. "Lucas," she said, stepping toward him, "what is this? You, live here?" He nodded, throwing the rag on the hood of the truck. For now, yeah, this is my spot. She looked around, her gaze sliding over the bare ground, the barn, the old well. You bought this? Why? To start over, he said simply, his voice as level as the horizon. I needed something of my own. Erin paused, her fingers fiddling with the strap of her bag. Lucas, I wanted to talk about us, about what happened. He looked at her face, which was still beautiful despite the shadows under her eyes. Erin, we've already said everything. You know that. No, not everything. Her voice grew louder, almost desperate. I know it's my fault. I know I ruined everything. But I don't want you to live like this in a barn, in the wilderness, alone. You deserve more, Lucas. He almost smiled, but it was bitter, like coffee he'd forgotten to finish. I'm not alone, Erin. I'm with me, and that's enough. She stepped closer, her eyes shining as if she were holding back tears. You can't just write me off. 15 years, Lucas. We built a life together. I made a mistake, but I still love you. Does that mean nothing? He looked at her, and something stirred in his chest, not love, not pain, but something like pity. But he didn't give in. It meant everything, Erin. Once. But now I'm not the man who was with you. And you're not the man you were. We both know that. She covered her mouth with her hand, her shoulders shaking, but she wasn't crying. She looked at him as if she were seeing him for the first time, not the Lucas who'd fixed trucks and was coming home, but the Lucas who'd chosen himself. And that scared her, because she knew she was too late. He wasn't angry. He was free, and that freedom was as foreign to her as this piece of land, this barn, this new life he was building without her. Do you really want this? To live here in the void? She asked, her voice almost a whisper. This is not a void, he said, looking out at the horizon where the sun was setting behind the hills. This is the beginning. Erin drove away, and Lucas watched her car disappear into the dust, like all his trips. He went back to the barn, turned on the light, one bare bulb hanging by a cord, and continued working. He felt the silence embrace him, but in that silence, something was being born. Not a plan, not a dream, but something solid, like the foundation he had begun to lay for the shop. He knew it would be slow. He knew there would be nights when memories of her would return like coyotes in the dark. But he also knew that here on this earth, he would find himself. Not a husband, not a truck driver, but Lucas, a man who built, a man who fixed, a man who lived. The divorce was finalized a few months later. The papers were signed, the house was Erin's, and she paid him his share as he had asked. The money sat in the account, but Lucas was in no hurry to spend it. He bought more tools, some sheet metal, and an old bench he planned to restore. The workshop grew like a plant pushing through the rocks. Neighbors began to move in, a farmer with a broken tractor, an old man with a motorcycle that hadn't started since the 80s. Lucas fixed things, listened to their stories, drank their coffee. He wasn't alone. He was part of this land, this silence, this new beginning. And in that silence, under the stars that looked down on him every night, Lucas felt something inside him come alive. Not love, not pain, but life new, honest, his own. Autumn in Montana smelled of pine and damp earth, and the morning fog curled over the hills like smoke from a dying fire. Lucas' heart stood outside his barn-turned workshop and watched the first rays of sunlight break through the clouds, illuminating his property, 5 acres of quiet that were his new beginning. He held his coffee, steaming in the cold air, and felt the morning chill sting his cheeks. The shop was already taking shape. The walls were reinforced, the new roof kept out the rain, and the inside smelled of new wood and machine oil. This was his place, his sanctuary, but even here, in this quiet, thoughts of Erin sometimes came back to him like old tires you don't know what to do with. Today was a rare day without work. Lucas had been planning to dismantle an old motorcycle engine that a farmer from Chester had brought him, but the morning began with an unexpected visit. The crunch of gravel under tires announced his arrival, and Lucas saw a familiar blue pickup truck climbing the dirt road. It was Danny Cross, his old friend and now the manager of Hart Trucking. Danny, with his thick beard and eyes that had seen too many roads, was one of the people who knew Lucas better than Lucas knew himself. They hadn't seen each other in a couple of weeks, since Lucas had handed over the company to him, and Lucas felt a little tense, not knowing what to expect from this visit. Danny climbed out of the truck, stretched, cracking his knuckles, and grinned at the barn. "Damn, Lucas, are you going to become a hermit? This place looks like you're preparing for the end of the world." Lucas chuckled, taking a sip of coffee. "Maybe so, but for now, just the workshop. Want some coffee?" "I'll take it. Just not from your thermos. I know what that tastes like." Danny clapped him on the shoulder and walked over to the shed, looking around at the tool racks and the workbench piled high with parts. "Not bad, bro. Seriously, you were always good at that, fixing things that were broken." They sat on old folding chairs at the entrance to the barn, and Lucas poured Danny coffee from a can he kept on the gas burner. The morning was still, save for the birds calling somewhere in the pines and the wind rustling the dry grass. Danny sipped his coffee, grimaced, "Damn, this is worse than I thought," and looked at Lucas with the blunt honesty that had always been his trademark. "So, Hart, how are you holding up? Not about the workshop, but about, well, about all this shit with Erin." Lucas looked away, looking at the horizon where the hills dissolved into fog. He didn't like to talk about it, but Danny wasn't one to be brushed off. "I'm holding on. The divorce is going on. The house is hers. I'm here. It's that simple." Danny chuckled, shaking his head. "Simple, you say? Bro, you kicked her ass out of the house, and I'm damn proud of you. But I know you. Somewhere in your head, you're still messing around, wondering if maybe you screwed this up." Lucas squeezed the mug, feeling the warmth burn in his palms. Danny had hit the nail on the head, as always. Despite his decision, despite the freedom he'd found on this earth, there was still a nagging question in the back of his mind. Could he have done anything differently? Could he have saved their marriage if he'd been home more often, if he'd talked more, if he'd noticed her loneliness sooner? He didn't miss Erin, or at least he tried to convince himself he didn't, but guilt was eating away at him like rust. "I'm not digging," he said, but his voice was quieter than he intended. "She made her choice. I made mine." Danny set his mug down and leaned forward, his eyes serious, almost hard. "Listen to me, Lucas. You didn't destroy your family. You stopped turning a blind eye. Erin, she's a bitch, always has been. You just didn't want to see it. She was screwing Harper while you were working, while you were building this house of yours, while you were dreaming of kids you never had. It's not your fault, brother. It's hers. And damn, I'm glad you finally realized that." Lucas froze, Danny's words hitting him like a hammer on an anvil. He knew the truth, he'd seen it with his own eyes in the motel, but hearing it out loud, so bluntly, was like a blow to the chest. He wanted to argue, to say that Erin hadn't always been like this, that she'd once been the girl with the pigtails who'd laughed at Bucks, the one who'd drawn the plans for their house, the one who'd cried at night over their lost children. But he couldn't, because Danny was right. Erin had made a choice, and it wasn't him. "You think I didn't see how she acted?" Danny continued, his voice low, almost a growl. "I was in the Shelby while you were out on the road. She was always like this, bright as neon, but empty inside. She needed the sparkle, Lucas. Not you. Not your truck. Not your house. And you gave her everything you had, and she threw it away. So don't sit there and blame yourself. You did what you had to do." Lucas stared at his mug, at the dark surface of the coffee where his face was reflected the face of a man who had lived for 40 years, but was only now beginning to understand who he was. Danny was rough, his words cut like knives, but there was truth in that roughness that was freeing. Lucas hadn't destroyed their family. He'd simply stopped pretending it existed. "You may be right," he said finally, his voice rough as gravel under tires. "But that doesn't make it any easier." Danny nodded, his eyes softening. "It shouldn't. This shit hurts, brother. But you're here, on your own land, building something new. That's more than most. I've seen guys break down after this drink, fight, disappear. And you? You're fixing this barn, fixing yourself. That's strength, Lucas. Not everyone can do that. Lucas smiled for the first time in the entire conversation, and it was a real smile, albeit a small one. You're quite the philosopher, Dan. When did you have time? Ha, that's the road, bro. Lots of miles, lots of thoughts. Danny grinned, finished his coffee, and stood up, slapping his knees. Listen, I didn't just stop by to talk. I've got a booking in Great Falls, but I thought maybe you'd like to come along for a ride. Like old times. One ride, you and me, a few beers after. What do you say? Lucas looked at the barn, the workshop, the land that awaited him. He thought of the road, the hum of the engine, the miles that had always been his salvation. But now he had something else, not escape, but purpose. Maybe another time, Dan. I've got a lot to do here. Danny nodded without pressing. Got it. But if you change your mind, you know where to find me. He walked toward the truck, but stopped at the door. And one more thing, Lucas. You did the right thing. Don't forget that. Lucas watched the blue truck disappear into the dust and felt Danny's words settle in him like stones at the bottom of a river. He hadn't broken up his family. He had stopped closing his eyes. And this wasn't an end, it was a beginning. He went back to the barn and turned on the radio, and Willie Nelson's voice, warm and husky, filled the space. Lucas picked up a wrench, lay down under the bike, and began to work. The dust settled, the truth floated, and in that silence under his hands, something new was being born, not just the shop, but himself. The Montana morning in October was sharp as a knife blade, with a chill that stung the skin and a sun that climbed lazily over the hills, as if reluctantly waking. Lucas' heart stood at the entrance to his shop, a former barn that now smelled of new wood and varnish and metal. His lot, 5 acres of bare earth with a few patches of stiff grass, seemed alive in the light, not empty but waiting, like a blank slate on which to write a new story. He held a mug of coffee, steam curling in the air like smoke from a campfire, and looked at his Kenworth, parked at the edge of the lot. The truck was his past, his faithful one, but no longer his only one. Now he had a shop, his new anchor, his new road. Lucas had spent the last few weeks transforming the shed into a place to work. He had reinforced the walls, put up new shelving, brought in an old workbench that creaked like an old man but held up well. The shelves were piled high with tools, wrenches, drills, hammers, jars of nails and screws he had collected over the years. In the corner stood a welder, battered but functional, and next to it a stack of lumber he had bought from a sawmill in Havre. This wasn't just a place to fix tractors or motorcycles. This was a place where he could create, not fix, but build from scratch without a trace of the past. He decided to start small but meaningful. Not an engine, not a frame, but something that would stand in the workshop as a symbol of his ability to create as well as destroy. Lucas chose a table simple, wooden, with sturdy legs and a wide tabletop on which he could lay out tools, drawings, or just put a mug of coffee and watch the sunset. It was not just furniture. It was proof that he could build anew, even if Aaron was no longer around, even if their home, their life, was in the past. He started with the boards, pine, rough-grained, smelling of resin and forest. Lucas had chosen them not for their beauty, but for their honesty. They were solid, unadulterated, like himself. He worked all day, listening to an old radio that only picked up one station, country and sometimes blues. Johnny Cash's voice, rough as sandpaper, sang of the road and loss, but Lucas didn't listen to the words. He listened to the rhythm that set the pace for his movements. He sawed the boards, measuring each one with the precision of a trucker who knows that an inch off can cost miles. The saw creaked, sawdust fell to the floor, settling on his shoes, and he could feel the sweat trickling down his back despite the chill of the morning. By midday, he had assembled the frame, 4 legs held together by crossbars. He took his time, checking every corner, every seam, as if this table were more than just a table. He remembered fixing trucks with his father, how his father had taught him, do it in a way that won't make you ashamed to put your name on it. Lucas had no intention of putting his name on this table, but he wanted it to be worthy of his hands. He planned the boards for the top, feeling the wood give, smooth under his fingers. It wasn't just work, it was like breathing, like coming back to himself. By evening, he had finished the base. The tabletop was wide, slightly uneven, but warm to the touch, as if alive. Lucas had sealed it with a varnish he had found in the corner of the barn, old but still good, with a smell that made his head spin. He watched the varnish soak into the wood, bringing out its grain, and thought about how long it had been since he had done anything like this. At Hart Trucking, he had fixed, patched, brought back to life what had already been. Here, in the shop, he created. It was a new feeling, like a sip of cold water after a long trip. When the varnish was dry, Lucas carried the table to the center of the workshop, set it under a bare light bulb hanging by a cord. He ran his hand over the surface, feeling its smoothness, its warmth. The table was simple, unadorned, but it was his. The first, a symbol of not being broken, not stuck in the past, not drowning in pain. He could build. Not a home for Aaron, not a family that never happened, but something of his own that no one could take away. He sat down on an old chair, put his mug on the table, and looked around. The workshop was still damp, the walls were not completely paneled, the floor was covered with sawdust, old paint cans lay in the corner. But it was alive. It smelled of his work, his sweat, his future. Lucas remembered Danny saying, "You stopped closing your eyes." And it was true. He saw himself now not a husband, not a truck driver, but a man who could take boards, nails, varnish, and make something that would stand, even if it was just a table. Night fell on the property, and the stars lit up like lanterns on a deserted road. Lucas stepped outside, inhaled the cold air, and looked at his barn, at the light streaming through the window. Silence was everywhere, not heavy like the house he had left Aaron, but light like the wind swaying the grass. In that silence, he could hear himself, his footsteps, his breathing, his heart, which beat steadily without breaking. He was not alone. He had land, a workshop, a table he had built with his own hands, and that was enough. The next day, he continued working. He brought in more lumber, bought a new hammer, and started thinking about a tool rack. But the table remained in the center, like an anchor, like a reminder. Sometimes he caught himself looking at it, like a friend who would not betray him. He didn't think about Erin as much as he used to. Her calls were fewer, her texts shorter. She was still out there, somewhere in Shelby, in their old house, but she was part of another life. Lucas wasn't angry. He had no regrets. He just moved forward, one step at a time, one board at a time. One day, an old man named Roy, a farmer who had once ordered parts from Hart Trucking, stopped by. He brought an old tractor that coughed like crazy and asked Lucas to take a look. They got to talking, sitting at the new table, drinking coffee, and Roy, squinting, said, "You know, man, you've always been good at this, making things strong, like this table, like you." Lucas just nodded, but the old man's words settled in him like dust after a long flight. It was strong. It hadn't broken. And in this shop, under this sky, he was building not only the table, but himself new, real, free. The morning began with the usual routine: coffee from a thermos, an old radio humming the blues, and a plan for the day. Finish the tool rack he'd started last week. But the sound of an engine crunching over gravel broke the silence. Lucas wiped his hands on his jeans and stepped out, squinting into the sun. A black Ram pulled up to his lot, shiny as a showroom, with Idaho plates. A man in his 50s climbed out, wearing a cowboy hat and a scuffed leather jacket, with a face that looked like it had seen both drought and flood. He extended a hand as strong as a steel cable and introduced himself. "Glenn Walker, from Boys. Heard of you, Hart. They say you're the best around here when it comes to fixing stuff." Lucas shook his hand, mildly surprised. His shop had only been open a few months, and his customers were local farmers from Shelby or Havre with broken-down tractors or old motorcycles. But Boys, that was nearly 500 miles away. "How do you know about me?" he asked, his eyes narrowing, but there was no suspicion in his voice, only curiosity. Glenn grinned, taking off his hat and running a hand through his graying hair. A buddy of mine, Roy, from Chester, brought you his tractor a couple of weeks ago. Said you not only fixed it in a day, but made it run better than new. I drive ranch equipment trucks, loaders, anything that runs and breaks. I need someone who doesn't just patch up holes, but does a good job. Lucas nodded, feeling something warm but unfamiliar stir in his chest. He was used to being appreciated for his reliability, for always delivering on time, but this was different. This was recognition of his work, his hands, who he was. "What's the order?" he asked, crossing his arms and leaning against the door frame of the workshop. Glenn pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket, a list, handwritten, neatly lined. "I have a ranch in Idaho, 200 head of cattle, plus equipment that hasn't seen a second look since my father was a young man. 3 trucks, 2 loaders, and an old combine I want to restore for the boys' farm museum. I can bring them here, or pay your way if you come. I'll pay you well, Hart, but I want you to do it." Lucas took the list and ran his eyes down the lines. This was a big order, not just a repair, but almost a restoration, a job that would take time, skill, and patience. He looked at Glenn, at his steady gaze, and realized that this man wasn't looking for a cheap handyman. He was looking for someone he could trust. "How much time do I have?" Lucas asked, already figuring out what he would need to buy. "Welding rods, a couple of new drill bits, maybe another jack." "A month on the trucks and loaders. The combine isn't on fire, but I want it ready for spring. Name your price, and I won't haggle." Glenn smiled, but there was a certainty to his smile as well as kindness, as if he knew Lucas wouldn't say no. Lucas named a figure, fair but not cheap. Glenn nodded without blinking. "Deal. I'll send the first truck next week. If all goes well, I have other clients who'll want to work with you." He extended his hand, and Lucas shook it, feeling the deal seal was not just a contract, but something bigger, his place in this world. Glenn drove away, leaving a trail of dust behind him, and Lucas returned to the shop, to his desk, which stood in the center like an anchor. He ran his hand over the smooth surface, feeling the warmth of the wood beneath his fingers. This desk, the first he had built here, was his statement. He could create, not just fix. And now people were drawn to it, not the Lucas who had been someone's husband, who had driven freight on Highway 2, but Lucas Hart, the craftsman whose hands could bring old metal and wood back to life. It was a new feeling, like breathing air after being underwater for so long. He sat down at his desk, pulled out a notebook, and began to figure out what he would need to order from Glenn. He knew it would be a tough job. Old trucks were always finicky, and the combine would likely require parts that weren't being made anymore. But that didn't scare him. Instead, he felt the same excitement he'd felt in those days when he'd first driven a Kenworth, when the road was full of possibilities. Now the possibilities were here, in the shop, in his hands. By evening, he had finished the shelf he had started the previous week. It was simple, pine planks held together with steel angles, but as strong as his resolve. He hung it above the workbench, arranged the wrenches, drill bits, and cans of bolts. Each tool had its place, as if the workshop itself were telling him where everything belonged. He stepped back, looked at the shelf, at the table, at the light pouring in from the window, and felt something in his chest unclench. It wasn't joy, not triumph, but a quiet assurance that he was in the right place. The next day, Roy, the old farmer who had first trusted him with his tractor, stopped by. He brought an old motorcycle, a Harley, rusty, but with a soul, as Roy himself said. They drank coffee at the new table, and Roy, squinting, said, "You know, Lucas, I always said you were more than just a driver. You have golden hands. People can see it. It's not for nothing that this guy from Boise came to you." Lucas just nodded, but the old man's words settled in him like seeds in fertile soil. That evening, when the sun had set, Lucas walked out to the lot, sat on the hood of his truck, and looked up at the stars. They were the same as the night he'd first arrived, but they seemed closer now, as if they approved of his choice. He was no longer Aaron's husband. He was no longer the guy from Hart Trucking. He was Lucas Hart, a craftsman whose work spoke for him. People were drawn to him not for the facade, not for the promises, but for what he made with his hands, with his heart. And in this silence, under this sky, he knew he'd found himself. Not in the past, not in the pain, but here, where every nail, every bolt, every seam was his. His name, his essence. Winter had crept up on Montana like a thief, blanketing the Shelby fields in a thin layer of frost that crunched under his boots like broken glass. Lucas Hart stood outside his shop, leaning against the doorframe, looking out over the property that for 6 months had become his home. The pines on the horizon swayed in the wind, and the sky was gray as old metal, but there was something alive and cleansing about the cold. His shop was more than a barn. Now the walls were paneled, the roof was sturdy, and the interior smelled of wood and butter and the coffee he brewed every morning. The table he'd first built stood in the center, scratched from his tools, but still warm as an old friend. The shelves above the bench were stacked with wrenches and drill bits and cans of bolts, and in the corners sat the old motorcycle Lucas had promised to restore to life for a farmer in Havre. He was finishing a truck for Glenn Walker, a boy's customer whose order had become a turning point. Glenn had already delivered a second truck and promised another, and word of Lucas's shop had spread like the wind through a field. People were coming, farmers, truckers, even a guy from Great Falls with a rusty combine who just wanted it to look pretty. Lucas fixed, built, created, and every bolt, every weld was his signature, his way of saying to the world, "I'm here, I'm standing." He was no longer someone else's husband, a shadow of his past. He was Lucas Hart, and that was enough. The morning was quiet, except for a crow cawing somewhere in the pines, when Lucas heard a familiar sound, the crunch of gravel under tires. He wiped his hands on a rag that smelled of motor oil and stepped out, expecting to see Danny or Roy. But it was Erin. Her white Honda pulled up to the edge of the lot, and she stepped out, bundled in a dark coat, her hair pulled back into a low ponytail, her face paler than he remembered. She wasn't smiling, wasn't trying to look like the Erin who had once lit up his world. She just stood there, looking out at the shop, at the lot, at him, and there was something new in her eyes, not pleading, not anger, but something that looked like resignation. "Lucas," she said, her voice quiet but firm, as if she had been preparing for these words for a long time. "Can we talk?" He nodded, not inviting her in, but not pushing her away either. They stood in the cold, between the truck and the barn, the wind tugging at her coat as if it wanted to carry her words away. Lucas waited, his hands in the pockets of his jeans, his eyes on her face, but without expectation, without hope. He was ready to listen, but not ready to go back. Erin took a deep breath, her breath turning into a puff of steam. "I didn't come to ask you to come back. I know that's impossible. I came to say, I'm sorry." She paused, looking down at her boots, covered in dust. "Not for what you think. Not just for Jay, although that was terrible. I'm sorry for everything. For not being who you deserved. For letting us fall apart. For not seeing how hard you tried." Lucas looked at her, and his heart didn't clench like it had before. He didn't feel anger. He didn't feel pain. He felt only the cold air and the hard ground beneath his feet. "You don't have to apologize, Erin," he said, his voice as smooth as the asphalt. "We both made a choice. You're yours, and I'm mine." She shook her head, her eyes shining but no tears. "No, Lucas, you don't understand. I'm not looking for forgiveness. I want you to know that I see now. I see who you are. Not just my husband, not just a truck driver. You were always more than I could understand, and I'm sorry I didn't appreciate that while I had the time." Her words hung in the air like frost on the grass. Lucas looked at her face that had once been his world, and saw a woman who had lost herself, just as he had almost lost herself. But he had not. He had founded this land, this workshop, this table he had built with his own hands. He had not wanted her words, but he had accepted them, as he accepts the wind that passes and does not linger. "Thank you, Erin," he said finally. "But I'm moving on, and you should too." She nodded, her lips twitching as if she wanted to say something else, but changed her mind. "Are you happy here?" she asked, looking around the workshop, at the shelves, at the table that gleamed in the morning light. Lucas shrugged, but there was a sparkle in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Happy isn't the word. I'm where I belong. That's enough. Erin looked at him, and there was something like respect in her eyes. She knew this was the end not of their marriage, which was already in the past, but of their story. She turned toward the car, but stopped, taking one last look. Good luck, Lucas. You deserve it. He didn't answer, just nodded. She climbed into the Honda, and the sound of the engine faded into silence, like her footsteps that night when she left with her suitcase. Lucas watched the dust settle behind her car and felt the last thread that connected him to the past snap. Not with pain, not with anger, but with a quiet clarity. He was free. By midday, he had finished Glenn's truck. The engine purred like a contented cat, and the cab gleamed like new. Lucas signed the shipping papers and felt fatigue mingle with satisfaction. But he didn't want to sit still. He needed the road, not to escape, but to feel alive. He filled up his Kenworth, threw a backpack containing a thermos, a couple of sandwiches, and an old Creedence Clearwater revival tape into the cab. He didn't know where he was going, but he chose north, toward Canada, where the landscape grew harsher and the sky wider. Highway 2 wound through the plains, past frost-covered fields, lonely farms, and rusty silos. Lucas turned on the tape, and John Fogerty's voice, husky and honest, filled the cabin. He wasn't singing, but he could feel the music in his chest, the rhythm of the road merging with his breathing. The landscape was empty bare fields, sparse trees, a sky that seemed endless. But the emptiness wasn't frightening. It was his studio, his plot a blank slate on which he could write his story. He thought about Erin, about her words, about her apology. It was sincere, he knew that. But it didn't change anything. His choice hadn't been made that night when he'd packed her things, not in the motel when he'd seen her with Jay, but somewhere on the road, under the stars, in the solitude that had become his strength. He didn't know where that road would lead to new orders, new people, new miles, maybe. But he knew one thing. She was his now. The truck sped north, tires humming on the asphalt, the landscape unfolding before him like a promise. Lucas held the wheel, his hands as steady as the table he had built, the life he had chosen. And maybe the end of one road is just the beginning of the one you finally chose. We know many of you have experienced something similar. These stories are not just easy to hear, they bring back memories. If you've been through this too, please write how you coped. Maybe your comment will help someone not go crazy right now. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.